Hello, everybody. This is your instructor for this Business 121 course, James Tope. Okay, today's lecture, we're going to go over chapter 37, titled Business and the Environment, which is obviously becoming more and more of a topic as businesses grow, as population grows, as forests run nigh and waterways are being jammed with freight. The environment is becoming a pressing and more of a pressing issue, not only in our everyday lives, but in governments as well. Obviously, we're going to talk about some of the things our government's done to help kind of regulate this, kind of the business world's almost unrestricted in a way. It's just expanding, ever growing, right? And we constantly have to keep these businesses in check with the kind of things that they can create a lot of byproducts, chemicals, and overall pollution, right? So let's get into this chapter. So obviously, the United States is a very large country, right? We have almost every type of ecosystem you can name. It exists in the U.S. Subtropical, deserts, forests, wetlands, you name it, we have it here in the U.S. And up until the 1960s or the 1950s, really, there wasn't a lot of concern about the environment from a pollution standpoint. In the Teddy Roosevelt's administration, which was like the early 1900s, he started creating the national forest because we realized we had all these vast, wild, different ecosystems that needed to be protected. We realized that, but it wasn't until the 1960s that the everyday average citizen started realizing the pollution from industrialization, manufacturing, and all of that stuff existing in America as a result of consumerism, right? The production of steel, the production of automobiles, the mass production, rather, of all of these different types of products, aerosol cans, you name it, started, resulting in pollution. The first Earth Day, I'm sure we're all familiar with that, happened as long ago as 1970. So people as far back as that were starting to realize, hey, we need to protect this place, this little blue dot we call Earth, right? Operations of business firms had major effect on the environment. So if you're producing products that release chemicals and smog and smoke and all of these different particles and stuff that can cause pollution, harm the wildlife, harm vegetation, and obviously harm us as humans, this situation needs to be regulated. Policymakers find it problematic to balance the importance of allowing business production at optimal levels while maintaining environmental protection. It's one heck of a fight all the time, folks. And it still happens in politics. We want businesses to grow because what do businesses do? They provide the everyday person, the ability to make a living, to innovate, to create new technologies, to just continue to go, right? But we have to be very concerned as population continues to grow, as business keeps growing, and we have to be very concerned about our environment. It's becoming more and more of a pressing issue. In fact, some folks believe it's the issue of the century. I'm one thinking that it's right up there. It's just about our top issue in this country and for that matter around the world. All right, let's keep flying through here. So the government created the NEPA, the National Environment and Policy Act of 1970. Federal law required any public project, dam, stadium, canal, highway using federal funds to have an approved environmental impact statement prior to commencement of work. And an environmental impact statement is an assessment of the environmental consequences of a planned project that must be approved prior to commencement of any project with significant federal involvement, such as federal financing. So when you think about the Hoover Dam, the electric grid across this country, this was the U.S., the highway system, this was the federal government. So any project that's considered a public project using an X amount of federal funds must pass this environmental impact statement assessment, right? And it asks questions like, what is the environment impact of the proposed project? Are they going to change a waterway? Are they going to deforest a section of a forest somewhere, so to speak? What negative environmental effects will result from the proposed project? These got to be answered, folks. What are alternatives to proposed project, including no action? What short-term and long-term harm of environment resources will result from the proposed project? What irreversible and irretrievable commitments of resources will be consumed by the proposed project? These are tough questions. Let's read example 37.1 here. Several groups in New York proposed that a new highway be constructed in New York City to be called Westway. Plans for the highway included destruction of some old wooden piers located in the Hudson River. If you're not familiar with New York, the Hudson River runs right through there. Destroying the piers could have an adverse impact on the striped bass, whose habitat was in the river. It was alleged that the EIS failed to adequately address the striped bass issue, and Westway was never built. So something as you might consider trivial, striped bass, but yes, you cannot affect really the environment in any adverse way if you want to get federal fundings and go through with your project. So that provides a great example of how stringent the EIS statement, the assessment can be. Now we got to talk about, how do we regulate businesses, right? So the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, looked internal federal projects, right? Federal funded projects. The EPA regulates businesses, the private businesses across this country. It's created in 1970. This federal agency is responsible for regulating business activities impacting the environment. And folks, again, remember, this is administrative law. There's companies here in South Carolina that all they do is they go around and help manufacturers ensure that they're EPA compliant. The last thing a manufacturer needs is to be fined heavily or even shut down as a result of breaking an EPA guideline. The EPA conducts environmental research, assists states and municipalities with grants and technical advice, administers the federal pollution laws that cover businesses, sets environmental standards and regulations. That's that administrative law there, right there, folks. Sets the standards and regulations for how businesses how they interact with the environment, right? They're using rivers, they're using byways, highways, if you will. They're using natural resources, whether it's wood or ores, to create these many different products and services or whatever that might be. And the EPA regulates them, ensuring that they're being, as safe as they could possibly be. Because remember that tug of war that's happening all the time, right? You want to let businesses just go and go and go because people need, we need an economy, but at the same time, we need a clean and safe environment. So that's what the EPA is for. Major federal legislation protecting the environment, folks. We're going to talk about the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, also known as a Superfund, which we're going to get into. And when you think of Clean Air Act or even Clean Water Act, I know just a few years ago it was in Michigan, I think it was Lansing or somewhere in Michigan, where the water was just atrocious and causing tons of illnesses. And you got to wonder, where was the Clean Water Act there? But anyway, let's get started. So the Clean Air Act, and you notice this is around 1970. A lot of these different entities are coming into play. 1970 was a big year for taking a look at the environment and kind of recalibrating how we do things. So the Clean Air Act was created with recognition of fact, air pollution sometimes cross boundary lines or of local jurisdictions and extends into 2 or more states. So the factor that's a county away from us, sending pollutants up into the air, goes into the weather, the jet stream, and comes over here, right? Just because you are not, even near the issue, your air that you breathe can be impacted by things a long ways away. The law emphasized in protecting the environment, state regulation is insufficient and federal law is needed. A lot of times the states seem to be a little bit more lenient on businesses and kind of these best practices when it comes to environmental safety, and the federal government needs to come in and kind of, be the backbone, if you will. On international level, treaties among countries provide environmental protection. All states are required to develop air quality standards, at the very least, as rigorous as federal standards. And obviously, if you went into California, they probably have the highest standards, even more rigorous than the federal government. But some states, you got to keep an eye on, but they have to be at least as rigorous and stringent as federal standards. The standards can be primary standards, serve to protect human life and health. So the number one standard of Clean Air Act is human life, right? And I love animal life and I love wildlife too, but to me, nothing supersedes human life. Secondary standards serve to protect property, vegetation, climate, and aesthetic values. So these are the primary and secondary standards or goals to meet, if you will, with the Clean Air Act. Clean Air Act covers 2 forms of pollution: stationary pollution caused by stationary factories and other production facilities. Whatever pollution BMW, if you will, is polluting. For the most part, it's stationary. There are some airborne chemicals, but there's ways that they can set filters on some of the exhaust of these facilities, but it does certainly impact that immediate area, right? Mobile pollution caused by automobiles, trains, and airplanes, et cetera. So, or when you get in your car and drive across country, obviously that's a mobile pollution. And we have millions of these traversing the country every day, sending X amount of pollutants into the atmosphere. Amendments to the Clean Air Act require emissions from automobiles contain fewer pollutants. Think about Tesla, folks. Elon Musk's car company, probably the fastest growing automobile company as the market is kind of demanding safer and safer ways of ambulating, if you will, or moving from point A to point B. And he's there to supply that need with these, electric vehicles that virtually release, if any, pollutants whatsoever. I'm telling you, in 50 years, folks, America is going to be full of electric cars, and you'll see the combustible gasoline engine go away. But gasoline sold in the United States is cleaner, and the catalytic converters in cars and other things that kind of try to, in-house or they're still trying to get these gasoline vehicles to run cleaner and cleaner, but there's, you can never be 100%. Factories install new technology to reduce discharge of pollutants into the air. That's like BMW probably has the latest in technology. They're probably barely polluting at all outside of in a mobile way. But obviously new technologies are coming on every day that help factories regulate or help factories minimize the pollutants that go into the air. And the same thing with gasoline engines, but there's no such thing as 100%. And we're kind of getting to the point in our civilization history, we need to put the brakes on pollution. So love to see the new technologies come online, and knowing down the road there's going to be nothing but electric vehicles, at least in the West. All right, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. You got to have the Clean Water Act of 1972. Sets minimum standards of water purity similar to the Clean Air Act. Included such, and they view the standards as fishable and swimmable. Right? If I can fish and eat the fish and eat the wildlife that live within the waterway, if I can swim in it, these are some pretty good standards to have. That's good. An immediate standard of water quality allowing navigatable waterways to be used for propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and recreational purposes. There's the fishable and swimmable standards. Ultimate goal of Clean Air Act is to eliminate discharge of pollutants into the nation's waters. Here in the Southeast, folks, you see all these old mills along the rivers here. Boy, did they used to pollute the heck out of our local rivers, the Middle Tiger River, the Lower Tiger River, whatever that is. There's tons of mills, these old textile mills in the upstate, and they used to play a major role in the pollutants of our wildlife, our waterways. But obviously the mills are no longer in operation, but that's an example of how mills can get into, they can pollute our water. And obviously we drink this water. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, that the Greenville County water is amongst the cleanest in the country. So that's something to be proud of. It's a wonder we don't see it marketed a little bit more for the city's kind of marketing or the county's marketing, but if I'm not mistaken, our water is, if it's not the number one, it's like in the top 5 cleanest water in the country. That's certainly something to be proud of. An example here, an offshore oil drilling rig owned by BP. And this is a true story, folks. Operating in the Gulf of Mexico, exploded. Partially drilled well began spewing up to an estimated 60,000 barrels of oil per day. After several months, BP was successful in efforts to permanently cap the well. However, the leak resulted in a massive oil slick that substantially damaged coastal areas and marine life. I believe it was in this class earlier we talked about some of BP's marketing to kind of trying to change the way, the U.S., because this is a British company, right? I know that they spend a lot of money for local businesses in the Gulf region, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, these kind of Gulf, west coast of Florida, these Gulf Coast states that, there's businesses that rely on the ocean, that, they're family businesses, other, even corporate, I believe that, they were family fishermen's. The waterways were utterly annihilated by this BP spill, and they spent hundreds of millions of dollars to try to rectify that mistake. And they were obviously fined as well, if I'm not mistaken, by the EPA, and they paid the full fine. So this is a true story here. The Superfund, Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act of 1980, more popularly referred to as a Superfund. Law regulates dumping of waste onto land. Superfund designates specific sites. So it outlines specific sites where businesses can dump their toxic waste, whether it's medical waste, whether it's nuclear waste of whatever kind. They set the specific sites, place them on national priorities lists, and mandates these locations be cleaned up by the owners. The EPA has the authority to conduct cleanups when immediate action must be taken. So, like, for example, the Gulf spill, there immediate action needed to be taken. Enforce penalties against potentially responsible parties. Excuse me. I guarantee BP played paid a heavy fine to the EPA. Ensure community involvement. So obviously the community has a stake in its local waterways, its local environment. It involves whatever states that I think are touched by the area, and it ensures long-term productiveness. Superfund created a hazardous substance trust fund to help defray costs in cleaning environmental scarred land. And here's a great example right here. Hubbell Coal Company went bankrupt in 1977. Hubbell owned 10,000 acres of environmentally damaged land and had numerous creditors who had not been paid. The land was designated as a Superfund site. So this is what this is for. A non-for-profit came in called News Source, received federal grants. So federal grant is money to purchase the land, but was required to engage in a massive cleanup before reclaiming land for use as a park and wildlife preserve. So when you think about Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island here in the US, I think Chernobyl is going to be toxic for like the next 20,000 years. And I'm not even exaggerating. It's like an absurd amount of time. No one can live in the area, which I think is in modern day Ukraine. They're kind of in the news lately, right? But Chernobyl was a nuclear power plant. It had a meltdown. That whole area is toxic. And I know some kids go in there and they like sneak into the area. They take these little meters to determine where the pollution is, because I mean, we're talking toxic levels of radiation in the Chernobyl area in the Ukraine. So anyway, therefore the News Source was justified in conducting the cleanup under the authority established by the EPA. And again, administrative law, folks, playing a role in our everyday lives, our business lives, our everyday life, administrative law playing a crucial role. All right, lawsuits by private citizens. Obviously, citizens, everyday citizens are harmed by pollution and businesses enacting that pollution. For example, my grandfather worked in a mill and died of cancer pretty young. And a lot of people that worked in this little mill that he worked in Indiana got various types of cancers from the chemicals they were exposed to. A lot of families, took lawsuits out on this business for, kind of not, basically not keeping their employees safe. This was a ways back. So, even back then that, people were still kind of aware, and lawsuits were still viable. They still could be taken out on businesses. In today's world, businesses they tread lightly. They know that, you can easily be found guilty in a lawsuit by a private citizen if pollution from your business causes some sort of ailment. So types of lawsuits by private citizens: negligence, nuisance, trespass. Remember tort law, folks. Let's talk about some of these. Real quick example. Stefan owned a workshop adjacent to a small manufacturing company owned by Melvin. Melvin's company continually placed numerous bags of unprotected trash near the property line. Stefan observed presence of vermin on his property and wrote Melvin a letter requesting removal of the trash. That is, abate the private nuisance, right? That tort. If Melvin refuses to solve the problem, Stefan may hire a company to remove the trash and claim reimbursement from Melvin, or get a court order for Melvin to remove the trash. And obviously, this is a very light example, but we're talking serious diseases are happening. And I just remembered it was Flint, Michigan, where the water got in, the water was polluted. And if I'm not mistaken, tons of ailments as a result of drinking that water. So I can guarantee you the citizens of Flint, they've got some lawsuits for that city, and rightfully so. All right, so negligence, torts allowing a plaintiff to bring a lawsuit against a defendant under state law for causing personal injury or property damage. Businesses that create pollution frequently cause injury to people or damage to their property, and these businesses may be found liable by court for negligence. So, you and I live on 2 acres from a business. They have some sort of leak, pollutants go all over our land. It basically ruins our land, not only potentially causes injury to us through sickness, but utterly destroys the land that we own. I mean, that's a great example of negligence, and you as a private citizen have a right to make these businesses answer to that, right? Nuisance. Most states have laws prohibiting creation of nuisance, a condition that affects a person's or community's health, causes property damage, or interferes with well-being. 2 categories are private nuisance, public nuisance, which we've talked about, impacts the public property, right? And there's private nuisance, impacts private property. Let's read example 37.4 from the book here. Festa owned a home adjacent to a small manufacturing company owned by Hedberg that placed numerous, okay, this is the same example from a minute ago. I should have switched these slides around. Sorry about that. So just think back to that trash example, how that became a private nuisance, right? If that was on public land, like the public park or whatever, it would have been a public nuisance. All right, trespass. There's something called particle trespass, unauthorized entry into another person's property, land, or water, right? So go back to that factory example, releasing pollutants into the air. It gets into your property, onto your property, affects the vegetation of your property, the wildlife on your property, or your health. This is a particle trespass. Businesses that cause pollution are in effect sending pollutants onto another person's land or water. When it's escaping their smokestacks or whatever, most states recognize a cause of action for particle trespass theory that businesses are trespassing on another person's property with their pollution particles, which I don't know how you guys feel, but I'm completely okay with calling it that. Whatever you got to do to make these businesses answer for the trespass. And to me, particle trespass is almost more aggressive or absurd or vicious, if you will, than a physical trespass. You know, particle trespass, you can't see, you breathe it into your lungs, et cetera, especially if you have children. This is a serious breach of trust, right? Types of pollution, folks, we've talked about this, some of these as well. Most widely identified forms of pollution are those impacting air, water, and land, which we just discussed many different acts by the government to protect air, water, and land, right? Other pollution environmental issues are of great concern to society and subject to federal laws. Noise pollution, for example, in certain places, you know, you can't build a factory, right? You're not going to build a factory in the middle of a nice neighborhood. Noise pollution, you name it, you would not be able to do that. Pesticide control, not so much a serious issue here in the upstate because we're mostly an urban population, but if you go to the lower part of the state or the breadbasket of America, Indiana, Ohio, Iowa, Nebraska, those types of places, pesticides is a big deal. I come from the state of Indiana, and there's tons of pesticides that they've been spraying on the corn and the soybeans for generations, it seems by now. And you have tons of, you know, illnesses and different things with the deer, the animals that eat the vegetation, you know, the fish that swim in the ponds, the rivers and lakes. You know, when that pesticides runs off from rain, you know, off the land into the waterways, I mean, it just gets into everything. And pesticide control is a big deal in places like this. Solid waste disposal and obviously toxic substance disposal are serious issues. Excuse me. National resource conservation and acid rain. If you're a child of the 80s, you remember the term acid rain. I don't hear it used a whole lot anymore, but it's a real thing, which we'll talk about here in a minute. All right, so noise pollution. Exposure to loud noise for extended periods of time may affect an individual's ability to hear, cause mood swings, and alleged to cause injury to fetus and wildlife. And it makes me wonder with some of these mill villages around here in South Carolina that you have these communities just abreast or adjacent right to the mill, how they got their sleep at night. When I was a kid, I lived in Startex Mill, which is here in the upstate, and you could hear that mill running all night, let steaming and gas and noise and bangs and pings. But, you know, sometimes you got to kind of, you know, accept the good with the bad. You know, the place was there to provide jobs for everybody living in the community, but at the same time, you had to just kind of put up with the noise and steam at 24 hours a day. Pesticide control, continued use of pesticide often causes insects to become immune. We all know this. Like, you know, you use compound A on locusts one year, you come back and use compound A, it doesn't work. You've got to kind of switch it up. Stronger as a result, obviously, stronger pesticides got to be created, which cause more danger to the local vegetation, wildlife, and of course, humans. Individuals and wildlife may become ill or damaged by pesticides. This goes without saying. There's like deer in Indiana running around with like 3 ears and 4 eyes and 6 hooves. I mean, I've seen it all. I'm not even kidding. On trail cam from my cousin one time, he had a deer had 2 hooves on 1 hoof, and it was a result of pesticides and contamination. And that deer running around, drinking the water, eating the vegetation. Many individuals are not comfortable with having food grown in environments wherein pesticides are used. Why do we say organic, folks? Why do you go to every grocery store and see organic foods? No pesticides used, just earth and water. Most of the fruit that my family and the meat that we eat is always organic because we're trying to escape these hormones and unclean foods. I don't even want pesticides, you know, much less, you know, hormones put into my food. I don't even want pesticides put on my vegetation that I eat, right? Because I eat a lot of spinach, raw spinach, and I don't want to eat it if there's been pesticides sprayed on it. So I always get the organic, and organic foods are an ever-growing demand, just as electric cars are in American society. Real quickly, what we have to do to try to really, we have to make organic foods and electric cars more affordable for the everyday user, right? So you could totally get rid of dirty foods and combustible engines. We have to figure out a way, and I heard Elon Musk talking about this, making it affordable for the everyday citizen, right? Which is just makes good sense. usually we kind of, when organic food started first coming out, you thought of kind of rich people eating it because that was who could afford it. When Tesla's kind of first come out, you always think as well, just a bunch of rich people driving them, because I sure as heck can't afford one. But hopefully, things are being measures are being put in place to make those items that are cleaner, better for the environment, better for you and me, more affordable for the everyday consumer and user. All righty. Solid waste disposal. Many municipalities require businesses and homeowners recycle paper, plastic, glass, and metal products. If I'm not mistaken, the city of Greenville demands it, or they won't take your trash off. You've got to, recycle or and then sort it out or whatever. Put cardboard and glass in one thing, so on and so forth, which just makes good sense. Solid waste disposal can be very, if you're not recycling, it just becomes massive amounts of waste, right? Many companies are going green. That is, making products and packaging them environmentally in friendly ways. And we talked about this earlier in the semester, packages being more environmentally friendly, right? Less cellophane, less types of plastics, I believe, and more kind of organic products that can be broken down. You put plastic in the ground, dig it up at, 20 years later, it's still there. But we need to create packages that break down and become biodegradable, right? Toxic substance disposal. Quantity of waste materials that can cause great harm to humans or wildlife who are exposed to them. These are like medical waste and chemicals, right? I definitely want medical waste like burned, like get rid of that. And the same thing goes for chemicals. The Resource Conservation Recovery Act of 1976, RCRA, governed storage and disposal of toxic substances. Under the RCRA, EPA has authority to regulate facilities that generate, transport, treat, store, or dispose of hazardous waste. Let's read example 37.5 here. Where's it at? Let's make sure there's not the example here. Okay. During the 1950s, a surge in the construction of new gasoline stations resulted in the burial of an enormous number of gasoline storage tanks across the nation. So real quickly, what was the 1950s, folks? You go back 20 years before that, lots of people didn't have cars. But, get to the 1950s, almost, I think there was, now you're starting to see cars in every American household. Before that, you did not, believe it or not. These unprotected steel tanks had an expected life of 30 to 50 years. However, many of these tanks corroded rapidly and failed much sooner in the mid-1980s. The EPA established regulations that required owners of such tanks to upgrade or replace them with corrosion-resistant tanks that have the capacity to be monitored for future leaks, which again just makes good sense. But, the 1950s, we were an expanding country. The highway systems were being built. Consumerism kind of was started in America. The average American home could afford a radio, a refrigerator, indoor plumbing, and cars. It was, an ever expanding, if you will, decade for this country. All right, types of pollution, natural resource conservation. The United States has extraordinary forests and wetlands with great aesthetic, environmental, and economic value. Think about the Florida wetlands, folks. It's almost disappearing every day. Think about the vast forests of the West, the vast forests, even here in the Appalachian forest. I mean, we're talking, I think they were saying some of the forests in Appalachia, the Appalachian Mountains, go back to Pangea. And if you don't know what Pangea is, it was back when all the continents were still together. We're talking eons ago, but some of these forests are that old. Like that's like moss growing on moss, right? Policymakers struggle with designing laws and regulations protecting these resources without disturbing natural ecological order, which that's tough to do. How do you designate laws and regulate and protect these resources without disturbing the circle of life, if you will. All right, acid rain. If you're not a kid from the 1980s, you may have never heard this, but this is sulfur emissions, folks. Light a match, blow it out, that's sulfur. It has a strong smell. Created primarily by manufacturing plants located in the central United States, cause pollutants discharge into the atmosphere and result in so-called acid rain. Acid rain obviously damages forests and crops, kills fish, and destroys paint finishes on automobiles and buildings. So, and what stinks about acid rain, it goes with the weather. So you could be hundreds of miles away from the issue and still have the effects of acid rain as the weather brings a rain system to your home, to your backyard, to your local environment. Greenhouse effect. I know we all know what this is, or have heard this term. Basically, it's the trapping of the sun's warmth in the planet's lower atmosphere due to the greater transparency of the atmosphere to visible radiation from the sun than to infrared radiation emitted from the planet's surface. I threw this definition in here in case any of you want to know what that was, but scientists believe increased burning of fossil fuels, that's coal, that's how we get our gas and oil, folks, fossil fuel, has loaded the atmosphere with heat trapping carbon dioxide, CO2 as it's known, creating global warming, a condition known as the greenhouse effect. And if you're interested in the planets at all, like the planet of Venus is kind of known as greenhouse, it's like greenhouse gone mad. That planet's got so much radiation and CO2, it traps in all the heat. And if not mistaken, like rocks on the surface of Venus are like molten. They're kind of like gooey because it's so hot. So just imagine that. We do not want that for our future here on good old planet Earth, right? Obviously, rising temperatures, melting polar ice caps. When the ice caps melt, the sea levels rise, right? So all these cities and towns that have been built on the sea, like especially when you think of Greece and places in Africa where they have been sitting on the coast for eons, these polar caps melt and the sea levels rise. We're going to see these cities get submerged, right? It's already happening in some places, and places like New York that are right on the edge of the ocean. What could happen if the temperatures continue to rise and rise and rise, right? And these polar ice caps continue to melt, and obviously the rising sea levels. We're talking a complete disruption of the ecosystem around the world, folks. Serious issues here. All right, destruction of rainforests. Growing recognition, economic interest are causing gradual destruction of the world's rainforests and tropical climate. So I always think of Brazil, right? The Amazon. And if you've ever met anybody from Brazil, I've got quite a few friends from Brazil, and they talk about the vastness of the rainforest and how you can walk in and just utterly get lost and wander for months and days. It's so encompassing. It's so, I think all of like northwestern Brazil is the Amazon rainforest. And we're talking dense, folks. And what does forests do? What do trees do, folks? Anybody remember photosynthesis from like 8th grade science class? That's how we breathe. It takes out carbon monoxide out of the air, if I'm not mistaken, and releases oxygen. This photosynthesis is crucial to life on Earth, right? Deforestation alters distribution and circulation of water, which may lead to drought, flooding, soil erosion, changes in wind and ocean currents, and in rainfall. So when you deforest and you change an ecosystem, you are altering everything that goes through there, whether it's the water, whether it's obviously the wildlife, plant life, you name it, you are devastating it. Another serious result of deforestation is absorption, I'm going to get this right, of carbon dioxide from an atmosphere is reduced. Remember photosynthesis, as we just talked about. All right, destruction of the ozone layer, chlorofluorocarbons, say that 3 times fast. The release of chlorofluorocarbons into the air has damaged ozone layer in the atmosphere. And real quickly, I remember in the 1980s, they talked about aerosol cans, like hairspray. All my family went to church, and every Sunday everybody put their whole can of hairspray on their hair before they, went outside and went to church. And they talked about these aerosol cans putting holes in the ozone layer. And I can remember being a kid so scared about that. Like, wow, like that hairspray is destroying the earth. A hole in the ozone layer is most manifest over the South Pole, causing concern over its potential impact on human health. This is a serious issue. Because the ozone layers protect the environment from ultraviolet rays of the sun, damaging this shield could lead to major problems for humans, agricultural products, forests, and wildlife. This just goes without saying. This ozone layer is a protection, right? You remove that protection, the radiation of the sun and all that it entails could obviously destroy agriculture, forests, wildlife, and then, of course, ourselves. So something we got to worry about. Biodiversity. Of concern to environmentalists is the notion that thousands of species are becoming extinct at an alarming rate. As sea levels rise, folks, as temperatures rise, as deforestation, as all this altering of the Earth's natural environments, if you will, we're talking massive extinctions across the country, or across the world, I apologize, from this change that's happening so rapidly on our world, right? It's estimated since the year 1600, approximately 260 animal species, 370 insect species, and 380 vascular plants have become extinct. Now, obviously, there you could argue a lot. In 1600, there were no plants. There were no manufacturing facilities. In 1900, there wasn't a whole bunch of them, right? It's really been this last 60, 70, 80 years to 100 years in the world that we've seen a rise of these new types of pollutions and concerns, right? And obviously ocean pollution, whether it's plastic, chemicals, tons of things are being dumped into the ocean every day. Ocean dumping is allowed under limited circumstances, which I guess that makes sense. The EPA is charged with the responsibility of selecting appropriate sites and types of waste that may be discarded into the oceans by U.S. organizations. And you hope to think that the things that are being dumped, that are allowed to dump in there, are able to be biodegradable, break down, microscopic life, eat it up or whatever, and it's gone. But plastics and other like types of chemicals, they never go away. So, and I know that there's this new kind of ocean cleanup, I think from Denmark, and I forget what it's called, but it's trying to get all the plastic out of the ocean. And I don't even know how much it is, but I've seen a number before about just the weight of it. It will blow your mind, folks, blow your mind. All right, I think this is our last slide of the day, or the last, coming up close. We have space pollution, folks. I guess we've been going into space since the 1950s. The Russians were the first to put up a satellite called, for the life of me, I can't remember it all of a sudden. Sputnik was what it was called. And since then, we've been going up on a regular basis. We've have, pieces of tools and pieces of satellites and pieces of this and pieces of that are floating around the Earth in an orbit. Some of them are in dying orbits, which means after they spend, go around the Earth enough time, they die, they come back into the atmosphere, and a good portion of it burns up, but not everything, right? Environmentalists have recently turned attention to increased amount of space junk orbiting the Earth. Satellites no longer in use or in disrepair continue to orbit the Earth, folks. They're up there in these continual, indefinite orbits, right? And they move at high rates of speed, 15, 20,000 miles an hour, right? It is estimated that there are more than 10,000 of these satellites in orbit. Wow, let that sink in. In 2008, a Navy missile scored a direct hit on the fuel tank of a dying spy satellite orbiting 130 miles over the Pacific Ocean, eliminating a toxic threat to people on Earth. So probably what was happening is this, this spy satellite was in a dying orbit. It's so big that all of it's not going to burn up. And if it goes into a populated area, a lot of people are at risk, right? So being able to shoot these down and bring them down like over the ocean where no one's at risk, that's a good idea. But space pollution is becoming more and more of an issue. And if I'm not mistaken, they track every piece that's up there. You got the International Space Station up, you got SpaceX sending rockets up on a regular basis. The last thing you want to have do is a socket wrench that a astronaut dropped 20 years ago come fly and hit your spaceship or your rocket as you're taking off, right? It would annihilate it. But anyway, so space pollution, definitely an increasing and challenging problem coming, that we're facing as a result of advancement in technologies. Excuse me. All right, our final discussion is overpopulation. Obviously, as medical science gets better and wars or mass famine is less and less, population continues to grow at a rapid rate. Current world population is around 7 billion, 7 times that of 200 years ago, and estimated to rise to 15 billion by 2100 or 2100. That's going to be double as what it is today, a little over double. So the problems that we've discussed in this chapter are only going to become increasingly more of an issue. Deforestation, destruction of vegetation, pollution, all of this stuff, we're going to have to pay the piper. We're going to have to address these issues. It's important that we attack them now, right? So things like the EPA and these different things that the federal government, our government in the United States has put into play to help, mitigate some of this are becoming more and more of a need. And as time goes, going to be more and more crucial. So folks, that was chapter 37, pretty interesting chapter, a lot of neat things to talk about, but it's another chance to kind of see how administrative law affects our everyday life, how we interact, how we do business, and how we interact with the environment. So if you have any questions, obviously don't hesitate to reach out for Thursday's lecture. And real quickly for today's lecture, the only thing you need to do is be account present is simply send me an email saying that you watched the lecture. For Thursday's lecture, which I'll send an email as a reminder, I'm going to have you guys answer the first 20 questions on page 580 and page 581 and send me those in an email, and that'll count you presents for Thursday's class. Obviously, too, this is leading into our last week of class. So the next chapter, I think it's chapter 38, will be our last chapter in this class. And then it'll be time for finals and time for test 4. So it's starting to be the crunch time of the class. Folks, don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. Like I've always told you guys, my goal is to get you guys out of here and with an A, if at all possible. So feel free to reach out, folks. We'll talk with you soon.